Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to everyone. So today I will be presenting my case study entitled The Impact of Bilingualism on Language Development, a comparative case study of Safia and Arif. So this presentation examines how bilingualism influences children's language learning, but importantly, it argues that bilingualism alone does not determine success. Rather, what matters is how bilingualism is experienced within a learner's environment. Mindless is compared to learners who are both bilingual in different ways. Yet they develop differently because the quality of input, opportunities for interaction, and emotional conditions surrounding their learning are not the same. So this presentation follows the structure shown in my deck, which I begin with the background and big idea, then move into objective, methodology, case profiles, findings, theoretical analysis, critical evaluation and application, and finally conclusion. So what I want to establish from the very beginning is that this is not just a descriptive comparison between two children, but it is an analytical study of how student develop is shaped by context. In many discussion, bilingualism is presented as something automatically positive, as exposure to two languages will naturally produce stronger language ability. But my study challenges that oversimplified view. My study challenges the oversimplified view. I argue that bilingualism should be understood as a dynamic process, and it can be a powerful advantage, but only when the learner is supported by meaningful input, authentic interaction, and a learning environment that reduces fear and encourages participation. That central claims guides the whole presentation. So we'll be looking at the background. So as shown on this slide, the background of the study begins with the recognition that children will today learn in a multilingual environments, that bilingualism is not automatically beneficial. The slide also highlights three major influences on language development: the quality of linguistic input, opportunities for social interaction, and emotional and motivational factors. Finally, it states that bilingualism is a dynamic and context-dependent process. So this background is important because it reframes the discussion from the very common but misleading assumption where we often hear that bilingual children naturally become better communicators or more cognitive flexible simply because they know two languages. However, that view ignores the fact that language are not learned in a vacuum. The children may technically be exposed to two languages, but if one language is only encountered through memorization, correction, and also exam drills, then that children's development in that language may remain limited. On the other hand, if the children uses both language in real communication, receive supportive responses, and also learns in a low anxiety setting, bilingualism can flourish. So this study starts from a critical position where it recognized that the real question is that not whether bilingualism exists, but how it functions within the learner's lived experience. In other words, bilingualism is not just about the number of languages present, but it is about the condition under which those languages are used, valued, and developed. That is why the background is not merely introductory, but it establishes the conceptual lens for the entire case study. So we'll be looking at the slide 3, which is the PCDL big idea. This slide presents the PCDL big idea, where children's language learning is shaped by the interactions of three contexts, namely the linguistic context, the learning context, and the learning context, and these factors collectively influence language outcomes. This idea is central because it prevents us from explaining language development too narrowly. If we focus only on the linguistic context, we may only ask whether the child hears enough English or Spanish. That is important but incomplete. If we try to only focus on the learner context, we might discuss motivation or anxiety without considering the actual teaching environment. If we focus only on the learning context, we may describe classroom practices without considering the child's home, language background, and the strength of the PCDL framework is that it forces us to see the language learning as the result of interaction between these dimensions. So in Sophia's case, these three contexts works together in a relatively supportive way. Linguistically, she has strong exposure to Spanish because at home and meaningful exposure to English at school. But as a learner, she is able to participate confidently because the environment allows her to take the risk. But in terms of learning context, she interacts with the student, teachers, and peers in a way that support communication. In Arif's case, however, these contexts do not align as effectively. Linguistically, English exposure is more limited and more formal for Arif's case. And as a learner, he experienced higher anxiety and less confidence because they have no one to talk with. And in terms of learning context, English is often confined to a subject-based classroom rather than an authentic communication. This big idea is not abstract. It becomes a very useful framework in interpreting why Sophia and Arif developed differently. So, moving on to the fourth slide, we'll be looking at the objective. So, this slide outlines three objectives. First, to compare two bilingual learners in different contexts, which is the one that second, to analyze how input, interaction, and emotions influence learning, and third, to explain these differences using the theories of Krashen, Vygotsky, and Cummins. So these objectives are important because they show that study is moving on three levels. The first level is comparison. I am not looking at only one learner because a single case could easily be mistaken as an individual case. By placing Sophia and Arif side by side, I can show that what looks like a personal differences may actually be a contextual difference. So the second level is analysis. I am not only identifying that their outcomes differ, I am investigating why they differ by focusing on input, interaction, and emotion. And the third level is explanation through theory. This prevents the presentation from becoming anecdotal, but instead of saying Sophia does better because her school is better, no, but the theories allow me to explain the mechanism behind those outcomes. This is also where the rubric matters. To reach a higher band, I need to demonstrate not just organization but critical understanding. These objectives help me to do that because they move from a description to interpretation. By the end of the presentation, I am not merely showing two cases. I am using them to demonstrate that language development is shaped by social, cognitive, and emotional process working together. So we'll be looking at the methodology. This slide identifies the methodology as a qualitative case study approach based on documented research from Buak and Kaya 2023 and Yana 2022 with a focused comparative analysis of learning environment. The reason a qualitative case study is appropriate is that this topic requires depth rather than the broad generalization where language development is complex. So if I only rely on a surface statistics, I might be able to show that one learner performed better than the other one, but I would not able to explain how that happened. So the choice of two documented sources is also methodologically important. Buak and Kaushankaya provide a case relevant to bilingual development, where input quality plays a central role, while Liana provides a Malaysian as a context in which English exposure is shaped by the schooling practices. And at a deeper level, the methodology also reflects the purpose of the assignment. The task is not asking for a simple summary of literature. It asks us to understand children's language learning as shaped by bilingualism or multilingualism in relation to context. So let's look at the first case profile, which is Sophia. This slide describes Sophia as an 8 years old Spanish English bilingual learner. where Spanish is used consistently at home, which gives her a strong first language foundation, but English is acquired through a school immersion with frequent interaction with teachers and peers, and with exposure to rich, meaningful, and continuous input. So, Sophia proposal is significant because it shows what supportive bilingual development looks like. Her language experience is not fragmented, and home expansion is stable, meaningful, and emotionally grounded, but it is not a weak or marginal language in her life. So this matters because a strong first language can support conceptual development, identity, and confidence. Then, when she enters school, English is not introduced merely as a isolated vocabulary or grammar exercises. It is encountered in immersion, which means it is used for real purpose in a real environment. She hears it, responds to it, and uses it in social interaction. Then we move to the second case profile, which is Arif. This slide presents Arif as the 9 years old Malaysian learner. Bahasa Melayu or Malays is used at home as the dominant first language. English is learned mainly as a school subject, with limited opportunities for real communication, and with exposure focused on explicit grammar and basic instruction. So Arif's case is not presented here as a failure, but as a learner shaped by a more constrained environment. This distinction matters because it would be too easy to interpret his limited English development as a problem of effort or talent. No, however, the details of the slide suggest a deeper issue where English exists in his life, but largely within formal schooling, unlike Sophia's life, which they extend the Spanish and English and embed into her life. And then this has several consequences where first our exposure to English is narrower in purpose, and then because English is tied too strongly to schooling, it may feel evaluated rather than expressive. That this kind of context can reduce confidence because learners begin to associate English with the possibility of mistakes rather than with the possibility of communication. So Irish proper is not simply the opposite of Sophia's, it is a case that reveals how a language can be taught without being fully lived. And next, we will be looking at the first finding, which is translanguaging. And this is one of the most important findings in the study because it is directly challenges deficit-based assumption about bilingual learners. At the surface level, many teachers or observers might interpret this utterance as an incorrect or incomplete English, but if we look more carefully, both utterance reveal something more important than error. They reveal a communication intent. Sophia and Arif are both drawing from the linguistic resources available to them in order to keep communication moving. They are not silent, they are not giving up, they're actively constructing meaning. So this matters because translanguaging shows that bilingual learners do not always operate with two sealed languages boxes in the mind. Instead of they draw from an integrated repertoire. So in Sophia's case, Jugar enters in English sentence because it is the most accessible word at the moment, yet the sentence still communicates a clear intention. While in Arif's case, saya don't understand similarly combines resources from Bahasa Melayu and English in order to express immediate communicative meaning. So however, lies in the different educational meanings of this behavior. So this environment seems to allow room for such experimentation. That Miss translanguaging can become a bridge to fuller provision. She can test language, receive natural feedback, and continue participating. For Arif, the same behavior may occur in a more correctness-driven environment where mixed language is more likely to be treated as something to fix. When that happens, that the learners may begin to monitor himself excessively, speak less, and become more anxious. The more critical conclusion is that the same linguistic behavior can support growth and trigger inhibition depending on the environment around it. So next, the second finding is the quality of input, where this slide contrasts of this meaningful contextual input and continuous exposure to interaction with arts, explicit role-based instruction, and focus on grammar and accuracy, and limited meaningful use. It concludes that with a critical segment, not all input leads to acquisition. This is a very important analytical point because in language education, people often assume that more exposure automatically means more learning. But this slide make a more precise argument in input only becomes powerful when it meaningful, processable, and connected to use. Sophia's input is rich because it is contextualized, and she does not just hear English, she hears it in situations where meaning and matters. She asks, responds, clarifies, and participates. That means language is constantly tied to purpose. But Arif, on the other hand, is not necessarily absent. She does receive English, but the character of that input is different. If English is mainly encountered through grammar rules, textbook drills, and past completion, then the learners may develop declarative knowledge about the language without gaining fluency in using it. In other words, he may know about the language more than he can operate through the language. So, next, the effectiveness factor. This slide contrasts Sophia's low anxiety environment and encouragement to experiment with language against Arif's high anxiety, exam-oriented context, and fear of making mistakes, where it includes that a high affective filter reduces language acquisition. This finding is especially important because it reminds us that language learning is not purely cognitive. It is also emotional. Sophia's environment appears to give her permission to try, make mistakes, and continue speaking. That matters because the children learn language more effectively when they feel safe enough to take risk. Every new utterance in a second language involves uncertainty. If the environment responds to that uncertainty with support, experimentation increases. If the environment responds with judgment, anxiety increases. In Arif's case, reflect the second possibility where English is strongly associated with exams, performance, and correction, and the learner may begin to see language use as a test rather than as a communication. Fears of being wrong then becomes stronger than desire to express meaning. Once that happens, learning is constrained, and not because the learner lacks ability, but because the emotional energy is being diverted into self-monitoring, hesitation, and also avoidance. This is where the findings becomes critical, because rather than descriptive, because it shows that the language acquisition is influenced not only by what learners are taught, but by how they feel while being taught. A classroom can provide correct input and still fail if the emotional climate blocks participation. So the effective path should not be treated as an extra or soft issue. It is one of the central conditions that determine whether input is actually processed and whether learners are willing to speak at all. So next will be the fourth finding, which is the social interaction, where this slide explains that Sophia's experienced frequent peer interaction and natural scaffolding, whereas Arif's learning is more teacher-centered with limited communicative practice. It concludes that interaction is essential for language development. This finding is crucial because language is fundamentally social. Children does not develop communicative competence only by listening or memorizing. They develop by using language with other people. Sophia's environment supports that big process. When she interacts with peers, she has to negotiate meaning, respond in real time, and adjust her language according to the situation. Those are powerful learning moments because they force learning into action. While our teacher-centered environment may still provide instruction, yes, we cannot deny that, but instruction alone is not enough. If most classroom communication moves in a one-way direction from teacher to learners, or if learner talk is limited to brief or correctness-based responses, then the learner has fewer opportunities to develop fluency. So fluency, flexibility, and confidence and all. This does not mean teacher guidance is important, okay? It means that guidance must open into interaction rather than replace it. So the deeper point here is not simply practice after learning. In many cases, it is part of the learning itself. Through interaction, learners receive feedback. That is why the slide's conclusion is so strong. It does not say interaction is helpful. It says interaction is essential for bilingual development, especially in childhood. That is highly defensively claimed. And the question theory, we're looking at the question theory. This slide explains that language acquisition occurs through comprehensible input, or I+1, and that the effective filter influences how input is processed. So it applies the theory by stating that Sophia's received rich, meaningful input with low anxiety, but leading to effective acquisition, whereas Arif receives limited input with high anxiety, leading to reduced acquisition. Question theory helps explains why Sophia's environment is more productive than Arif's, because the idea of a comprehensible input is not just about hearing the language, but it is about encountering language that is understandable enough to process, but challenging enough to extend learning. So Sophia's school immersion and interaction with others likely provide exactly the kind of input that we want. She constantly exposed to language in use with context, helping her make sense of meaning. She can understand enough to stay engaged and learning continuously. So the effective filter component that deepens the analysis. Even if input exists, learners may not fully process it. When anxiety is high, right? This is high. This is highly relevant to Arif's case. If he is worried about the correctness, or if English feels like a space of judgment, then his emotional state interferes with the acquisition. So question allows us to explain not only differences in input, but differences in how input is received. A critical readers of this, the critical part of this slide is that Sophia and Ari are not simply receiving different amounts of language. They are receiving language under different conditions of comprehensibility and emotional openness. That distinction is what makes the same language classroom experience so productive for one learner and so restricted for another. So next we'll look at the Vygotsky social-cultural theory, where this states that learning occurs within the zone of proximal development (ZPD), and the entire development is supported through an interaction and scaffolding. It applies the theories by saying that Sophia benefits from peer interaction and collaborative learning, while I lacks sufficient scaffolding due to limited communication opportunities. So Vygotsky is especially useful here because in his theory, the focus from the language is as an internal system to language as socially mediated process. Sophia does not develop only because she has more English around her. She develops because she participates in communicative relationships where others help her move beyond in what she could independently. In other words, her learning is scaffolded. This is very important because analyzing child bilingualism, young learners often need cues, models, repetition, and reformulation, and interaction support. These forms of scaffolding are often provided naturally by peers and teachers when communication is active. Sophia's learning context seems to offer those supports. She can hear models, attempts responses, and carry it forward by social participation. Arif's case highlights what happens when scaffolding is reduced. If English is used limitedly mainly to instructional tasks, then opportunities for responses for the scaffolding are fewer. The teacher may still provide explanation, but the learners may not be drowned into enough collaborative meaning and making, and that means the ZPD is less actively used. So the Vygotsky help us to see the language growth is not only about the learner's effort, it is about the presence or absence of social support structures that make development possible. So we're looking at the Commons Cup theory, where this slide states that languages share a common underlying cognitive proficiency, and that skills from L1 can transfer to L2. It applies that the theory saying that Sophia transfers conceptual knowledge effectively from Spanish to English, while Arif's transfer is limited due to disconnection between languages in the learning context. So Commons is very useful because his theory helps us understand why the strong first language is not an obstacle to the second language development, but can actually support it. Sophia's strong foundation in Spanish likely to provide her with conceptual resources, narrative understanding, and general language awareness that can transfer into English. She does not start from nothing when learning English, right? So she brings cognitive and linguistic knowledge with her. So this is especially important because because some educational contexts still treat the first language as interference. Commons challenges that view, and he suggests that beneath the surface differences between languages, there are shared underlying proficiency that can support development across languages. And this means that strengthening the first language can actually support second language learning. In Arif's case, reveals what happens when that transfer is not effectively activated. It is not that he lacks a first language base, rather the learning environment may not help him use the base of a bridge. If English is treated as a separate, formal and grammar heavy, The learner may not experience meaningful connection between what he already knows in Bahasa Melayu and what he is trying to express in English. So the issue is not lack of potential for transfer, but it is lack of contextual support for the transfer to operate. So this is the critical evaluation for for this case, where this slide make a three strong point. Bilingualism does not guarantee successful language development. Outcomes depend on how languages are used within the environment. And there is an important distinction between knowing the language as grammar knowledge and using the language as a communicative competence. It is also noted that language status and learning context significantly influence outcomes. So this is the heart of the critical argument, where up to this point, the presentation has shown differences between Sophia and Arif explain them through theory. This set takes the next step by evaluating what those differences mean. The first point is powerful because it rejects the simplistic slogan-like view of bilingualism. A child can be bilingual on paper in the sense being exposed to two languages, just still experience uneven or limited development in one of them. So bilingualism is not a guarantee, it is a condition whose outcome depends on context. The second point about how languages are used is even more important. Languages can be present in a learner's life in a very different way. One language may be used to build relationship, but that does not necessarily mean he can use English confidently and simultaneously. This is a major issue in language education. Many learners perform reasonably well in written exercises, yet hesitate in real communication. So this slide is important because it forces the analysis to move from surface attainment to actual communicative development. So next, we're looking at the Malaysian historical context. This step matters because it situates Arif's case within a wider education reality. His experience is not merely personal; it reflects structural features that can affect many learners in similar contexts. When English is primarily positioned as an academic subject, learners may become skilled at completing exercises without becoming confident users of the language. So this is not because grammar is unimportant, but because grammar alone cannot build this communicative competence. So the exam orientation intensifies this problem. Once performance becomes the main goal, teaching may shift towards what is measurable and correctable. That often means more drills, more focus on errors, and fewer opportunities for exploration taught with the learners. Learners then become cautious. They may wait for the right answer and everything instead of talking communicative risk. This directly affects fluency and confidence. So the significance of this slide lies on the ability to connect the individual's case to the broader system. I would say Arif's limited communication development is not only about his own learner traits, it's also about how English is institutionally framed. This makes the analysis more critical because it shows that educational structure can shape language outcomes just as powerfully as individual motivation. Next, the pedagogical implication, where this implication follows logically from the analysis. If high anxiety limits acquisition, then classroom must reduce effectiveness barriers. If languaging is a sign of active meaning making, then it should be not automatically penalized. If first language knowledge can support second language learning, then one should be used strategically as a bridge rather than being treated purely as interference. So the point of balancing accuracy and communication is especially important because this presentation is not arguing that grammar should be abandoned, right? Accuracy still matters. However, when accuracy becomes the only goal, language becomes narrow and defensive. Learners need both. They need to develop correct forms, but they also need to opportunities to use the language meaningfully and enough that those forms become functional rather than merely memorized. So to conclude, the final slides. To conclude my presentation, I would like to return to the central argument of the study. Bilingualism is not simply about having two languages present in a child's life. It's about how those languages are experienced, used, and supported. Sophia and Arif show us that language development is shaped not only by exposure but by structure and quality of the exposure. Sophia's case demonstrate how strong can make bilingualism an advantage. Our case shows that when English is restricted to formal instruction and performance pressure, development may refrain limited, even if the language is technically present. So the most important conclusion is that meaningful communication matters more than passive exposure. Learners do not develop language most powerfully when they only receive it. They develop it when they use it, negotiate with it, and feel safe enough to grow through it. Therefore, bilingualism becomes truly powerful not by existing alone, but by being supported through context. And that's all from me. Thank you.